Consumed. Westlake Trilogy Book 1 by J.C. Jarrett. Chapter 6. Giving a Hand on the Farm. Stevel Westlake raised a cloth to his head to wipe away the sweat from his brow. There was no denying that Rand and Stevel were brothers. Both had the same wide-shouldered build, dark hair, and eyes. Thought Stevel's hair was a good bit more gray than Rand's. The morning sun was already warm, and the farmer feared it'd just get even warmer as the day stretched on. Picking back up his garden hoe, Stevel continued to churn the earth in an effort to rid his vegetable garden of his worst enemy, weeds. Never the warrior like his brother, Stevel had other talents that his brother would say was more important than being able to fight and kill. Stevel was happy with just being a farmer, but he knew one day his son would probably follow in Rand's footsteps. Darton was 12 years old, and the son of Stevel and Norma Westlake. He was more like his uncle Rand than his father. It didn't bother Stevel too much that Darton wanted to be like his uncle. Rand was a great role model. It was just the thought of him fighting and possibly dying that bothered the farmer. As he stood there attacking the weeds, he looked up to see his son Darton, a near miniature version of himself, just with darker hair, shouting to him. Stevel watched his boy for a few seconds, then realized he was pointing toward the small road that ran to the large single-story house him and Rand had built years ago. Raising a hand to shield his eyes from the sun, Stevel saw an old wagon rolling up the road. Grumbling about unwanted visitors, he gave up his fight with the weeds and headed toward the house. Peyton awoke, but lay still, enjoying the feel of her against him. Her rhythmic breathing seemed to bring him peace, and that had been in short supply lately. Elisa had nestled up to him, her slender body pressed to him, with her head still rested on his bare chest. Peyton raised his head just a bit to look at the woman. He watched Elisa sleep, thinking this was probably the first truly restful sleep this poor woman has ever had. The young warrior watched her for several minutes, taking her all in. Though still grim-covered, he could not get over how beautiful he found her. She was the embodiment of the old saying, "A diamond in the rough." The words had left his lips as if under their own accord. At the sound of his voice, her emerald green eyes fluttered open, catching him watching her. "Good morning," she said, showing no sign of wanting to move away from him. A small smile curled the corners of her mouth at catching him watching her. Everything the warrior had planned to say escaped him, the sight of her smile stealing his words. Peyton fastened his belt, holding his trusted twin straight sabers in their scabbards around his waist. Then he turned to Elisa, who was putting on a pair of wicker sandals one of the goblin women had brought her along with their breakfast of fruit and cheese. He looked at her. The rags she still wore filthier now than when he first saw her, but he knew that was all she had for now. Peyton picked up the silver sword, which rested in a scabbard with a belt that had been given to him from Gorthok's belongings, and then turned back to the young woman. He moved up close to her, wrapping his arms around her slender waist. She never moved an inch in protest. Reaching around to the front of her, he fastened the belt, pulling it snug. "Just in case," he said to the beauty. She looked down at the silver hilt hanging from her slender hip, thinking how foreign it looked there. "I have no idea how to use it," she said, eyeing the warrior who wore a slight smile watching her. "You know I said the same thing to my father when he strapped my blades on me, and he gave me some of the greatest words of wisdom you will ever hear. Now I'll give them to you." His smile widened as he finishes, "You put the pointy end in your enemy." She returned his smile. "We don't have the time right now, but I will teach you everything I know. Later, you will have your whole life to learn to use it." His words and their true meaning did not get by the girl, and her smile widened even more. Elisa watched Peyton check and recheck his gear, and then she saw him draw each blade, freeing them up in the scabbards, so if he needed them quickly, they would not stick. She looked down at the silver hilt. Gasping it, she drew the blade. With a sudden light, its blade edge flare blew for barely a second, then faded away. Peyton and Elisa both looked at the blade with amazement. The weight of it in her hand felt perfect. Even though she had never held a sword before, It felt almost natural. She replaced the blade as Peyton draped his dark brown cloak over her shoulders. Then, taking her by the hand, the pair exited the hut, ready for their journey. The morning sun was just touching the village, causing the goblins to begin the day's work. Chief Garrick walked slowly toward the small hut with 3 other goblins in step behind him. Looking up, Garrick saw the humans exit the hut as he approached. "Peyton, I believe you remember Grubneck. He is now the hunt master. He and his hunters will travel with you to the edge of the goblin lands," the chief said, then reached out and took Peyton's elbow, leading him a little way from the others. "When you see your father, tell him that I have paid my life debt to him," the ancient goblin spoke. "Remember, you and your woman will always be welcome here. Good journey," the goblin chieftain finished as he walked away after clasping hands with the human in friendship. Nearly 3 hours of traveling through the dense forest, the unlikely group of 3 goblins and 2 humans stopped in a small clearing. Setting in the middle of the clearing was a stone no more than 3 feet tall that had been crudely carved into the form of a goblin. "This is the edge of our lands," Grubneck said, looking at the stone statue. "But I would be more than happy to travel on with you to your destination." The huntmaster finished. He liked the humans and wanted to see them to safety, knowing the woods was not the safest of places. Peyton looked to the goblin who had been the first to show Elisa and himself that they were not the evil creatures some people made them to be. "No, my friend, go home to your people. It is not much farther, no more than an hour to my Uncle Stevel's farm," the warrior said, looking to the 3 goblins. "Thank you and your people for your kindness. It will not be forgotten." With those words, the human and the goblin clasped hands. Then they went their separate ways. Peyton and Elisa stood and watched the goblins as they disappeared into the foliage. Peyton looked at the woman at his side. "You ready to go home?" he asked her. Home she thought not, since before her mother died had she called a place that. In her mind, she was already home, though standing there with the young warrior. She reached out, taking his hand. "More than anything," she said, a smile of happiness on her lips. Rand's legs ached as he bounced in the saddle. It had been far too long since he had ridden any distance. The ache in his legs was no match for the pain in his hands. Nearly every knuckle was split open and both hands swollen badly from the beating he had given Grover yesterday. His thoughts fell back to how good it felt to finally teach that fat man a lesson, but he also knew it wasn't over. The horse galloped at a steady pace along the dusty road. Rand had sat worried through the night when Peyton never came home. He had decided that he may be at his brother Stevel's farm, so this morning he saddled his old brown mare and began to make his way. Rand had been on the road since first light, knowing it took nearly 5 hours to ride to Stevel's. He could not shake the feeling of something coming down upon them as he rode. Together, Peyton and Elisa made their way through the forest, and before an hour was up, had made it to the edge of the forest. Stepping from the tree line, the pair realized they were right on top of Peyton's uncle's farm. Peering across the several large fields of crops, they saw the large barn and single-story farmhouse setting nearly a mile away. "When we get there, I'm grabbing a plate full of my uncle's famous smoked ham," the young warrior said, his stomach growling in hunger. Elisa's eyes turned to him, a smile across her face as pair started toward the house. But before they had moved more than 5 feet, Peyton stopped. The warrior's eyes scanned the farm's fields, methodically looking for a sign of his Stevel or Darton at work, but could not see any sign of them. The warrior could not remember the last time he had been to this farm that his uncle or cousin did not come from a field where they had been working. Elisa watched the man, curious at why he stood there watching the fields. She knew him well enough by now to know that if he did something, it was for a reason. She waited as he continued to look across the farm, and just when she was about ready to ask what was wrong, he spoke. "There is something wrong here," his voice grave with worry of his family. "There is nobody working in the fields," he said to let her see why he worried. "So, something has taken them from their work." The warrior continued more for himself than her benefit. After a few more minutes of watching, the warrior reached out, taking her hand. "We should cut through the tall crops and make our way to the house out of sight, I want to be careful." She thought the warrior's idea was intelligent, and together they hurried into the tall fields of corn. After nearly a half an hour of moving through the fields, Peyton reached out and took her by the arm. Knelling down, they peered out from the edge of the tall stalks of corn toward the large farmhouse and barn that sat nearly 80 yards away. For several minutes, they stayed there watching the buildings and waiting for a sign. Peyton's warrior instinct screamed at him of danger, and he listened. So far, they have saved him several times. Then he saw it, the large window in the front of the house, its curtain pulled closed. Watching the window intently for several more minutes, he saw the curtain part just a small crack, as if someone was peeking out. Then after a minute or so, close back. Nearly 5 minutes later, it happened again. He knew his instincts had been right. Something was definitely wrong on the Westlake farm. "Please stay here. I'll be right back," he said as he pulled his feet under him. "No, we go together." But Peyton did not hear her words. His gaze had fallen onto something that caused his heart to skip a beat. A rickety old wagon set to the side of the house, partially hidden by a large bush. His breath caught in his throat. "Oh, gods," slipped from his lips, confusing Elisa until she followed his locked stare to the wagon. Fear crept into Elisa's mind at the sight of the wagon, Grover's wagon. Peyton tore his eyes from the wagon and back to the girl, now shaking with fear. "I'm sorry we don't have time to debate this. Please stay here where it's safe," the warrior said, his instincts taking full command of him now. The man and woman stared into each other's eyes for a long moment before he shot from the tall corn, sprinting the full 80 yards in just a few seconds. Elisa watched him and had wished she had the courage to have said the words that hung between them, but she had not. Never in her life had she met a man like him, kind and caring, then at the same time hard and very dangerous. She knew that Grover would never have a chance against him, at least she hoped. She knew that Grover would never let them live in peace, and it scared her that Peyton was risking so much for her. Looking down to her hip where the silver longsword hung, she drew the blade, its magical edge flaring with its blue light as it left the scabbard. She held the blade, feeling its perfectly balanced weight in her slender hand. Elisa's beautiful emerald eyes narrowed. If she had to, she would end the fat man to save the young warrior who had saved her. Peyton rushed to the house, making the distance in just a few seconds. Knelling by the wall, he listened, but beside the occasional bird chirping, he heard nothing. The farm was silent. Staying low, the warrior moved around the house, stepping onto the long porch. He moved against the wall and tried to peer into the window, but the curtain's fabric was too thick to allow him to see in. Dropping to his hands and knees, the warrior crawled under the large window to the heavy wooden door. Reaching up, he undid the latch, letting the door glide open a crack on its hinges. Peyton peered through the crack of the door, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the dim light inside. At a small table, he saw Stevel, his wife Norma, and their son Darton, all tied to chairs and gagged with lengths of cloth. The warrior stopped himself from rushing into the room, not knowing what else was inside. Rand pulled the reins of his mare toward the narrow path that cut in and out of the woods on the way to Stevel's farm. He knew from her it was only about 15 minutes at his pace. He couldn't wait to get off the horse. He had no idea how he used to ride for so long as a young man. Rand thought of Peyton. If that boy was here stuffing his belly with his brother's smoked ham while he sat worrying himself senseless, he may just give him a beating. The thought brought a small, short-lived smile to the worried father's face, but something told him that was not the case. Before he could react, the door swung open, taking the young warrior by surprise, releasing a huge boot into his face, launching Peyton into the air. Falling hard in the yard just beyond the porch, the wind exploded from his lungs, causing the young man to lay there gasping for air. Grover's great bulk stepped from the house, his large axe swing from his left hip. Hurrying over to where the prone warrior lay, he reached down, grabbing the buckle to the young warrior's weapon belt. Snapping it unloose, the huge man pulled on the belt hard, turning the gasping Peyton over on the ground. Having the young warrior's weapons, Grover turned, throwing them as hard as he could away from them. Slamming the wall of the house with a loud thud, the twin still-sheathed sabers came to rest on the porch. Peyton finally managed to pull air into his screaming lungs, gulping it down in great pants. His relief was short, lived as a huge boot slammed into his chest, racking his whole body in pain. Again and again, Grover brought the boot into the young warrior, who with every kick slid farther and farther away from his salvation, his blades. With a final brutal kick, blood shot from Peyton's mouth, running down the side of his face as he lay on the ground in agony. The warrior tried repeatedly to stand, but the huge man did whatever he had to keep him on the ground, trying to deliver as much punishment as he could. Peyton had no idea what was happening. All he did know was that if he did not get to his feet, he would not survive much longer, and if he did not survive, then neither would Elisa. At that thought, a sudden burst of strength brought him up on his hands, only to receive a vicious kick to the face. Blood shot from both nostrils as the power of the kick flipped him clear over onto his back. "Where is she?" the fat man shouted, hovering over the downed warrior. "Go! To hell!" The defiant young man managed to get out between gasps for air and blood-filled coughs. Elisa watched in horror as the events played out before her. She wanted so badly to run to help the fallen warrior, who had given so much to her, but she was paralyzed with fear. Her body quivered as tears ran down her face. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to charge in, but was so afraid that she may fail and make matters worse, knowing the young man would more than likely give his life for hers. Her mind was in a conflict with her heart, and at this moment it was a stalemate. Peyton lay upon his back. Blood covered the man's battered face as Grover began to gloat. "Not so tough without your blades, are you, little boy?" The fat man ending his words with a kick. "You're going to pay, Westlake, for doing this to me," the fat man shouted, holding out his ruined hand before the battered warrior. The boot shot from the ground, the kick impacting with the outstretched ruined hand, faster than Grover could pull it out of range. The fat man's scream of pain echoed throughout the farm, causing birds to take flight in fear. Clutching his hand and doubling over in pain, the fat man screamed in agony and frustration. The young warrior climbed to his feet, wobbling just a bit. His eyes came to rest on Grover for the first time since the fight began. The young warrior was shocked at the shape the fat man was in. If he didn't know it was him, he wasn't sure he could have guessed it. Most of his face was covered in dried blood, the left side swollen badly out of proportion. The worst, though, was the lifeless, milky white left eye. He had no idea what had happened to him, and he didn't care as he advanced on the fat man. Peyton was a warrior, a very well-trained warrior. Grover didn't take that into consideration. Yes, he took his blades, but that was not his only weapons. Grover raised his head to see the warrior's fist shoot out, catching him in the throat. The fat man clutched at his neck, couching and gagging. Peyton didn't let up his other fist slammed hard into the huge gut, but the fat man showed no sign of feeling the blow. The warrior instantly switched tactics, releasing a right hook into the left ear of the fat man, swaying his equilibrium. Grover managed to stay on his feet, though he now wobbled instead of Peyton. Grover steadied himself. The 3 attacks of the young warrior had come in so fast he had never had a chance to block or even react. Grover released his only good fist toward the warrior, but to Peyton it seemed to move in slow motion. Sidestepping the attack, his slipped himself into the fat man's blind spot. Grover panicked when the warrior seemed to vanish, still not used to having only the one eye. The fat man spun, trying to locate the young warrior, and did, running for his blades, grabbing the axe from his belt, knowing he would never catch the young man on foot. He gripped to axe in his left hand. Its handle felt out of place to him being right-handed. Pulling the axe back, he slung it forward and released it in a heavy throw. Instantly cursing as it left his hand, he watches as the axe spun end over end. At first, he thought he was going to miss the young man completely. But to his great surprise, the handle to the large axe slammed into the young warrior's head, sending him flying forward and face first into the wall of the farmhouse. There on the porch, he collapsed his blades no more than 4 feet away. Explosions of light popped into Peyton's vision as he received the double impacts of the axe handle and the wall to his head. Then darkness began to creep into his eyes as he tried to stay conscious. Grover ran for the down warrior in amazement of his luck finally changing, his great bulk swinging back and forth with every footfall. Peyton's eyes rolled it, their sockets dazed. His mind screamed to his limbs that would not respond. The warrior tried in vain to set up, but all he succeeded in doing was falling back to the wooden deck of the porch. Grover stood over the young man, an evil grin spread across his face. His grin was quickly wiped away when Peyton managed to make it to a sitting posture. Throwing a knee into the warrior's face, Peyton fell back to the floor from the impact for just a second. That was all the time Grover needed to collapse the same knee atop the down warrior's chest. Pinned to the floor by the fat man, Peyton tried to reach his blades, but they sat a few inches out of reach. Grover fought to hold down the warrior and reach across his wide body to retrieve his axe with his good hand, but he could tell he would never get it that way. Peyton's left fist came up quickly, catching that fat man in the chin, tossing some stars into Grover's eyes. In a last act of desperation, he grabbed for the axe with his throbbing, ruined hand. Rand rode around the final bend, seeing the farm span out before him. It always impressed the old warrior at how well his brother was at tending to crops and cultivating the land. With a chuckle, Rand thought that maybe it was his warrior's blood that caused things around him to tend to die. The chuckle quickly faded as his thought went to Jana and the dreadful night. Rand looked toward the farmhouse, his mind still on Jana and Peyton. "Peyton!" the father screamed, seeing the great bulk of Grover press down upon his son as he fought for his life. Putting the spurs to his horse, with a whinny, it bolted toward the house. The old warrior lowered himself close to the horse, urging the animal on. Grover's ruined hand touched the axe handle as several more punches lashed out at him. Thumb and little fingers wrapped the handle pulling, the axe head dragging across the floor. Grover's entire focus was on the young warrior who fought like a man possessed trying to free himself from the fat man. Suddenly, a high-pitched scream cut through the air. Grover turned his head just in time to see a bright silver blade, its edge flaring with a bright blue light swing down. Elisa gripped the blade in both hands and with all her strength swung it over her head, bringing it down, unaware of the scream that escaped her lips. The brilliant silver blade flashed its blue light brightly as it sliced through the forearm, like a hot knife through butter, cutting the fat man's ruined hand from his body. Grover grabbed at the stump, his scream of pain higher than the woman's scream of terror, as she brought the blade around again. The fat man managed to roll away from the woman, her swing missing badly. Peyton leapt to his feet. Reaching out, he placed his hand atop the woman's doubled fists on the hilt of the silver longsword. His touch calmed her and brought on a torrent of tears. She was so afraid he was going to die that she had to do something, and now that it was over, she was repulsed at her actions in maiming the fat man. Seeing she was uninjured, Peyton bent to retrieve his blades, dropping the scabbards where he stood. Rand pulled the reins of his horse, causing it to skid to a stop. Quickly dismounting, he looked at his bloodied son and the young woman. Peyton looked to his father, who shivered at the look in his son's normally friendly eyes. He had seen that look before, the look of a man about to kill. "This is between me and him." The young warrior said, his voice cold and calm, the same voice Rand had used 1,000 times in 1,000 encounters. "Son, you don't want to do this. He is beaten. You can stop now." The scared father said, not wanting his son to have to deal with his actions later. "Stevel and his family are tied up inside. Please release them." There was no emotion in the warrior's voice as he spoke. The warrior strode over to the fat man as he knelt on the ground, crying and gripping his stump in an effort to stop the tide of blood that poured from what was left of his arm. The tip of a slender blade to his throat got Grover's attention as he still sat. Holding his stump, looked up at Peyton's bloodied face, his eyes glaring with murder. "Stand up," the warrior's voice demanded. Grover listened and stood, his pain making his legs wobble. The slender blade pressed against the fat man's throat, causing a rivulet of blood to run over the blade. With a quick flick of his hand, the slender blade opened a deep cut under the fat man's ruined eye. "You've lost an eye." With another flick of the sword, he cut a long gash across what was left of the ruined man's forearm. "And a hand." The warrior's cold voice cut through him as quick as the blade did. "It is time for you to decide. Is torturing this woman worth what you have paid? Because it's about to be your life." After the warrior had finished his words, he looked at Elisa, who had moved to his side. Rand came from the house, followed by 3 confused faces, not having a clue about the situation. Peyton's ice-blue eyes narrowed as they fell back onto Grover's destroyed face. His muscles in his arm tensed to strike a killing blow. Elisa's hand gently came to rest on Peyton's forearm, stopping him from running the blade through the defeated man with just a touch. She looked at him, her emerald eyes seeming to stare into his soul. "You don't have to do this. He is defeated and knows it. Let him go to a fate worse than death. Every time he sees his stump or look in a mirror, he will remember you. Remember me. Remember us." With her final words, she reached up gently, placing a hand on his cheek, turning his face to hers. She saw the tears on his cheeks at the realization of what he was about to do. Slowly, the point of the straight saber began to lower to the ground. Peyton stood for several seconds looking at the fat man. The saber blade came back up, pointing at the old wagon. "Leave, if you ever show your ruined face near here again. I will not hesitate to kill you." The calm warrior spoke in a flat tone. Grover looked at the people surrounding him, then back at Peyton and Elisa standing before him side by side. He thought of pushing the point that the girl was his property. Quickly thought he changed his mind, worried that the dangerous young warrior may push a point of his own, his blade point. The fat man silently moved, limping toward his wagon. After several tries, he managed to climb aboard, pulling an old blanket from under the seat. He wraps his stump with it, still trying to stop the blood from seeping from it. Then, with an awkward motion, he snapped the reins with his one hand, causing the horse to begin its slow pace down the dusty road. Elisa reached out, taking Peyton's hand as they watched the wagon roll away. She couldn't believe it was over. She was free. Releasing his hand, she put her arm around his waist, resting her head on his shoulder. Grover couldn't stand it. He kept looking back at the Westlakes and the girl. Finally, his anger got the best of him. Turning, he began to holler. "This is not over, Westlake. You will see me again. This is not over." Then the wagon was out of sight around the first bend in the road. Peyton sat at the small table inside the house, the room now flooded with light from the newly opened windows. Rand had just finished bandaging Peyton's forearm and was now taking a damp cloth to his son's battered face. "Well, I would guess from the shape of you that you had quite the couple of days, son," the proud father said, knowing that his son followed his heart in doing the right thing. "Yes, we did," he said, looking back at the closed door on the side of the room where Elisa had been whisked off to by his Aunt Norma. "I did meet a very interesting fellow who knew you by the name of Garrock." The name caused his father's face to crunch up in confusion for several seconds. Then the light of remembering passed over his eyes. Garrock the Goblin," his father said, more than a little impressed with his warrior son. At the sound of the word goblin, Darton's ears perked up from across the table where he sat with his father, Stevel. "Come on, Peyton, tell us about the goblin. I bet they are mean and stinky," the excited boy said, practically laying on the table to get closer to the young warrior. So for the next hour, Peyton recounted his tale to his family as they gathered around, listening intently to his every word. Just as he got to the end of his tale, he was interrupted by a voice from across the room. "Gentlemen," Norma called from the doorway where she and Elisa had disappeared over an hour ago. They all turned to see Norma standing beside a beautiful woman in a light blue ankle-length dress. The light from the window reflected off her bright red gold hair as it framed her face and cast large natural curls down her shoulders and back. Her eyes sparkled, their emerald green color contrasting perfectly with her pale skin and red hair. Peyton knew that the girl was beautiful from the first time he saw her, but now she was positively breathtaking. Peyton stood and walked toward the beauty, a slight limp in his left leg. Elisa smiled bashfully as he reached her, putting out his hand for hers. "Walk with me," he asked, placing her hand in his, and together they walked from the house. Rand watched his son, now a man, leave with the beauty, and thought of the first time he had seen Jana. He wished she was here right now. She would have loved the girl that stole his son's heart. They were a lot alike, both strong, beautiful, and caring. He felt happiness for Peyton and Elisa for finding each other, but he hopes they understood that it may not last. Sometimes fate has other plans.